Now, for a little while. Before I introduce Fred Bahnson, though, I want to once again give you a little heads up about what we'll be doing after that. We will finish this time together at about 4:30, and then we'll have a little break again, and then we will go back over to the Murphy Center where we had lunch, and we'll go into the cafeteria, and the tables are going to be set up, and you'll go in through the line, and as you come in, you'll get a piece of paper with a number on it. We want each person to go to the table with their number on it, and there will be a set of questions there at your table for you to talk about the day and what you've learned, and what your thoughs are about faith and rural life, and so forth. Hope you'll introduce yourselves to one another and interact with one another and continue the dialogue that has been begun here this morning and this afternoon. This afternoon we have the opportunity to hear from Fred Bahnson, who is a farmer and a writer who lives in Transylvania County, North Carolina, with his wife Elizabeth, who played at the worship service this morning so beautifully, and his 3 young sons. Fred is a former Kellogg National Food and Society Fellow and the co-author with Norman Vertzba, who was one of our lecturers last year, of the new book called Making Peace with the Land. And I invite you to take a look for that book. I think there are a few flyers of it floating around here today. I think it looks like an inspiring book. Fred holds a master's in theology degree from Duke Divinity School, and in 2005 helped start the Anatoth Community Garden, a ministry in Cedar Grove that has become an inspiration for many other locations and churches to start their own community gardens. Fred will soon become the director of the Food and Faith program at Wake Divinity School, which just sounds fantastic and really neat. And Fred is the recipient of a Louisville Institute grant that has enabled him to travel around the country visiting faith communities that are involved in growing and distributing food in some way or another. And today, his presentation will include some of the fruits of that labor. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Fred Bahnson.
Good afternoon. So all those things that he just read don't mean a whole lot, but the thing I'm proudest of is that I'm married to that gal that you got to hear sing this morning. That's my real accomplishment if I have anything to boast on. I'm a lucky man. I thought I would give you guys a little short look into this book that Norman and I just finished. And if you saw, I got some propaganda floating around the audience. If you got some of these, this is the book. It's called Making Peace with the Land, God's Call to Reconcile with Creation. And Norman, who spoke here last year, and we sort of took turns writing chapters. He did more of the theology and the philosophical side, and I did more of the kind of storytelling. But we looked at how the church might re-engage with the land, with our food, and in a way that fosters reconciliation. And I'm going to be telling a few of the little stories from that book in my talk here. And I'm just going to jump right in. I'm also going to leave time for questions and some dialogue too. In the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, a collection of stories from monks who lived in the desert of Egypt back in the 4th century, there's a story that's one of my favorites. It's the tale of John the dwarf. One day, John the dwarf said to his elder brother, "I should like to be free of all care, like the angels, who do not work, but just ceaselessly offer worship to God." Sounds good, doesn't it? So John shed all his clothes and traipsed off into the Egyptian desert. Well, a week later, he returned, having lived off of who knows what out there in the Egyptian desert, a few locusts maybe. He returned famished, probably sunburned in unmentionable places. Remember, he had shed all his clothes. And John knocked on the door of his brother's little hut. But rather than opening the door, his brother asked, "Who are you?" John replied, "It is I, your brother John." "John has become an angel," his brother said. He is no longer among men." John begged to be let in, but his brother refused, leaving him to spend the night out in the cold outside the door. And in the morning, John's brother opened the door, and he said, "You are a man, and you must once again work in order to eat." But when it comes to food, I think most of us practice a kind of John the Dwarf spirituality. That is, we wish to be free of all care. We don't really wish to know where our food comes from or how it was grown, just so long as it shows up on the shelf reliably at Ingles. It appears there without a thought, and we don't really have to think about it. Those of us who tend toward more holy and intellectual pursuits, pastors, writers, students, I think we're especially prone to this temptation. We wander about in the desert, expecting our food to magically appear, while we get to follow higher, more angelic pursuits. But even with a motive as pure as John the Dwarf's, that is, ceaselessly offering worship to God, I think we must eventually end our naive sojourn in the desert and come home. Because we are men and women, and we must once again work in order to eat. Perhaps the biggest problem with the way we eat right now in this culture, in this country, is that we're seriously disconnected from the sources of our food. Food consumes a mere 10% of our budget, which is the least of any developed industrialized nation. Less than 10% of our dollar goes to food. If you're in Europe, it's more like 15 to 20% of your budget. If you're in an impoverished country like Haiti, it may be as much as 70% of your budget. So when you hear about rice and wheat doubling and tripling in price, well, you know, a 99-cent bag of rice, you think, oh, well, now it costs $2. Big deal. What's that all about? But if you live in Haiti and 70% of your budget goes to food, the price of rice doubling or tripling is a big deal. We also are in a country where less than 1% of us are farmers. And so most of us have no idea how food is grown or how poorly farmers are paid to grow it. We're disconnected from the sources of our sustenance, our daily bread, and as a result, our bodies and landscapes are suffering the result. This is a practical problem, but it's also a spiritual problem. For those of you who pastor in rural areas, you know very well where food comes from because many of your parishioners grow it. But I think those of us who live in more urban areas, this is a real problem. So what does this have to do with the church? I thought the church was responsible for worrying about souls, not worrying about the food supply. Well, it turns out that Christians have a lot to say about the food supply, especially when we remember that a meal, right, a Eucharistic meal, the Lord's Supper, the Messianic feast, that's our central metaphor, that's our central practice as the people of God. So that's our first clue that we need to pay attention to the food that goes into our bodies. Think about those disciples on the road to Emmaus. When was it that they recognized Jesus? It was in the breaking of the bread, right? Food is at the heart of our faith. For the past 2,000 years, Christians have looked to our Lord Jesus for the breaking of the bread. But given our current problems with food, perhaps it's time we extend our Eucharistic imaginations to the fields and tables beyond the altar, looking for him also in the growing of the wheat. Those of you in rural churches already know much about agriculture, but I think it's time for the rest of the Church universal, to start paying attention to agriculture. In an age of disconnection from the sources of our food, I believe that one of the most important tasks for the Church is to become God's extension agents. And what do I mean by God's extension agents? Actually, Jeremy came up with that title, and I've spent the last couple months writing this, just trying to figure out what that all means. No, it's a wonderful evocation of what I'm trying to say. God's extension agent helps broker the relationship between land, people, and food. I don't mean that the church should replace county extension agents. I don't mean that the church necessarily needs to be giving people advice about their tomatoes. I mean that when we look around our communities and we see people suffering from hunger and from obesity, which are really flip sides of the same coin, we need to do something about it. As representatives of God's kingdom on earth, the church is in a prime position to help foster that holy connection between land and people, which has been severed in our modern world. We are in a prime position to promote human flourishing. One of the best ways to promote human flourishing is to grow food with your neighbor and to share it. You might say that what the church needs to do is to create infrastructures of holiness. What do I mean by infrastructures of holiness? I mean creating new economies, new food economies centered around just that, sharing food together. Teaching our neighbors how to grow food and sharing it with each other. The foundation of any community begins with healthy food, because if our bodies aren't healthy, and if the land that feeds our bodies is not healthy, and if those farmers who grow our food are not getting paid enough, then the church really has no ground to stand on. If we're serious about preaching God's kingdom come on earth as in heaven, then we should take that on earth part seriously. God's abundant kingdom should be visible in our fields and in our tables. I think the kind of abundant life that Jesus offers is the kind of abundance where people's bodies and souls can both flourish, where human conviviality can flourish. And I believe that the church is called especially to help foster that flourishing. In the Old Testament, we hear about shalom, the Hebrew word for peace, but peace is more than just an absence of conflict. It means well-being, living in harmony with your neighbor and with the land and with God. It means getting enough to eat, but it also means getting enough of the right kind of food to eat. The kind that's going to make you healthy and make your neighbor healthy. The good news is that churches all around the country right now are creating these infrastructures of holiness. They're becoming God's extension agent right in their own local place. They're starting community gardens. They're buying shares in local farms and distributing it to their congregation and to the hungry. They're starting farmers markets. They're even selling beef. And I think it all comes from a deep desire that we have to be in relationship with one another. Food creates those relationships. Everywhere I go, I see churches starting these food projects. And I think that common thread that they have among them is that they're blurring the lines between what happens on the community table and what happens on the potluck table. At our church's community garden, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, one man told me that he hadn't set foot in church in 30 years, but But if a church was starting a community garden, he wanted to come to that church. People are drawn to places where they see human flourishing. They're drawn to places where people's basic needs are being met. And that happens in a wonderful way in a community garden. I got to learn about that firsthand. Back in 2005, I helped to start a community garden for a small rural Methodist church in Cedar Grove, North Carolina. It was 150 members, not a large church. And there was a whole long string of events that led up to a piece of land being donated to the church, which is a whole other story in itself, a wonderful story. But in 2005, we had 5 acres donated to the church. Here we were in this rural part of Orange County. People were going hungry. People who should have been living in Section 8 housing were sleeping in barns, fishing out of ponds, and getting by pretty much on the fish they could catch and the biscuits that they could make, and not much else. Fresh, healthy produce was just not, you didn't see it much. The nearest grocery store was about 10 miles away. So there's a great need, and there's all this land around us. The church could be growing food on that land. And so we jumped into this community garden project, started growing food, and without ever kind of meaning to, this simple act of growing and sharing food together snowballed into a bi-weekly potluck where just anybody could come and eat. Soon we had volunteers for youth, kids from the local, kids with community service hours to work off, coming down to do their community service at the garden. We had a children's program. We started doing concerts out there, bluegrass concerts. Built a little barn where people could have a gathering place. People started just coming and suggesting projects that they wanted to do there. So the point is that you start something small like this, and God just sort of takes it and stretches it out and adds to it, and it kind of builds on itself. It's less a program than it is suddenly about a new way of life that people catch a glimpse of. I want to tell you about a couple other places that I've had the opportunity to visit. One of those is the Lord's Acre, up in Fairview, North Carolina, up in the mountains. Back in 2001, several different churches from different denominations got together and decided to start a garden. Their first year, on a mere quarter acre, they raised 3 tons of food, just on a quarter acre. They donated it to the food bank, and now that garden is drawing people from all around the country to see what they're doing. One of the interns at the Lord's Acre said, "This garden makes social justice beautiful. This garden makes social justice beautiful." A nearby project called the Welcome Table in Black Mountain, North Carolina, started when a 5-star chef from Monterey, California, John Crugnali, looked around his community and saw a lot of hungry people. He decided to do something that sounded extravagant at first, and that was to do a weekly meal every Wednesday, a weekly free lunch, where anybody could come and eat. But it wasn't just Chef Boyardee warmed up, it was the finest food he could buy. He spent about $1,000 a week just going down and buying the best food he could. Because in the Bible he read that when you invite the hungry to a feast, what do? Do you give them the worst of your food? No, you give them the best that you have. And he's been doing that every week for a couple of years now. His program, once he started just feeding people all this amazing food, has now turned into a recovery program where ex-convicts can come and learn culinary arts. They can get a culinary degree while they're working at the Welcome Table. It's you never know what kind of things God will just start layering on, just for the simple act of just feeding people. Those of you who got to go to Crossfire's workshop were treated to a real treat. Anybody get to go to their workshop? Yeah, most of you. I got a chance to go visit these guys last year, last April and May, and it was just really taken with the vision that they have, and with just the sheer determination of a small church with very little monetary resources, feeding people who had less than they did, and then just out of that, things just started growing. They got a grant to do a greenhouse on the county landfill. They're going to start buying cows from farmers who can't get a fair price for their beef. They're doing a food pantry every week. Things just start building and growing from there. Another place I got to visit was a Pentecostal ministry, a Pentecostal farm out in Washington State called Tierra Nueva, which means New Earth. On the surface, Tierra Nueva looks like another bunch of good-hearted Christian folk doing social justice work. There's a family support center for migrants, a bi-weekly Bible study in the jail led by Chris and Pastor Bob, a people's seminary. Thanks to Chris and a few young staff members, Tierra Nueva started 2 social enterprise projects based around food. One is the Underground Coffee Project, and the other is a small organic farm that feeds the local hungry population. The Coffee Project is run by Zach Joy, a 6'7" former crystal meth addict and crystal meth cook, whose life had been turned around in one of Bob's jail Bible studies. Zach now took those cooking skills and he's roasting coffee with them. And every batch of beans that comes out of the roaster, he lays his hands on and blesses. And I drink that coffee every morning, and I feel blessed. I really do. To just think of, that's how God works, that taking this man's skills that used to be used to produce drugs, and he doesn't have to completely leave those skills behind. They're transformed and transformed and redeemed to be used for God's good purposes. They also buy those beans, by the way, from some small farmers in Honduras, paying them above market price for their beans. The New Earth Farm is a community-supported agriculture project out there that works with several Oaxacan migrant families and serves as a volunteer host site for juvenile offenders. So that I hope you're starting to see a pattern here that you start something small and all kinds of things that you couldn't have foreseen just start to stack onto that when God gets in and gets involved. I want to show you a short clip. It's a very short documentary that was made about our community garden. And then I want to get your questions and comments. So the big screen is going down. This is about a 9 or 10 minute documentary, and then we'll do some discussion.
Some men working next door, and they were looking across, and I was over near where they were. They were putting up a fence. They asked me if they could buy some of the collards that were there. They said, well, we can't find any collards where we live. And they were real country, North Carolinians, and collars, I guess, are part of their Thanksgiving meal or any special meal. And I said, oh, you can come on around and you can take some. They couldn't believe that we were just giving them away. I said, oh, we don't sell them here. You just come on around. And it was a wonderful thing, to be able to do that. That's what the garden's about, is giving of what we have.
You need to take something. Yeah, please help us by taking something. Salad? Lettuce?
I'll take two.
It seems natural to me that we should be involved somehow in the growing of our food. Whether that's even just harvesting a little basil every week, plant some tomatoes on your back porch. It seems that all of us should have some hand in food production. But I think it's especially important for the church to be involved in agriculture at the local level, because we're in the business of feeding people. That's Christ's calling. And so much as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me.
Probably 90-95% of Israelites were farmers. Very few of them were well-to-do farmers. So the Bible is very concerned about the work of farmers. It sees it as a theologically significant kind of work, because that's what most Israelites were doing. They understood it as a form of wisdom, and wisdom that ultimately they learned from God. But there also was ecological degradation in the ancient world, even in biblical times. It proceeded more slowly than it does now. So they knew that in order to survive from generation to generation on their land, they had to care for it very well. So there is a surprising, what I would call land sensitivity in the Bible.
The garden story actually began with a murder. A man was killed at his little bait and tackle store just up the road from where the garden now stands. And out of that murder came intersecting visions of two different women in the community. One, a black woman, Mrs. Taylor, had a dream where God wanted her to give 5 acres of land to the community as a way to somehow heal the wounds of that murder. Alongside that, you have Pastor Grace Hackney, a white woman who had this vision of how the church should be using land to serve the community.
I also think that life is going to be harder with peak oil, and certainly in the next generation or two, I think we will feel the effects of what we've done to both soil and water resources.
If you think about it, our entire agricultural economy is run on oil. If the oil ran out tomorrow, we'd all starve, or most of us would.
In the world, we're using so many resources that we will never be able to use again. But when we do things organically and use the earth how it's meant to be used, and let things grow how they're meant to grow, then it's going to create a higher yield, because that's how it's supposed to be done. And it's going to continue to get better and better. It's a bottomless source.
To me, it's the beginning of a change. To me, it's the beginning of a different way of life, and a way of life that I didn't grow up living, with a way of life that I know inside is the way we need to move forward.
Valley family gave the land to this church. Valley Mama had that vision. And I knew then that if his mother had that vision to give this church, that it would work. She was being led by the Spirit.
Early on, we had a group of volunteers for youth that came out, and it was cold, and it must have been maybe even in November. And it was our first kind of official work day with Volunteers for Youth. And the ground had just been lightly kind of tilled over. And we were all out there to pull out roots and rocks. And it was muddy and it was cold. And these Volunteers for Youth, they had on like clean tennis shoes, and their shoes were getting stuck in the mud, and they would try to pull them out and their foot would come out of their shoe. And there were two girls who probably had never been in a garden, or they'd never done any of this kind of work. One of them had this white jacket with fur around the edges and these really white tennis shoes. And they were not happy to be there, to say the least. And by mid-morning or so, they were down there pulling these roots out and falling back in the mud and just having a really good time. And these group of kids who were like, they're going to make us pull roots out of the ground and rocks. You didn't want to be there. By the time we all kind of gathered around to get some hot chocolate, everybody was laughing and happy to be there. And I think I had this epiphany that this is going to work.
But it's not just food that brings people. I mean, it's as much about the community and the friendships that are made as it is about the squash and the green beans.
I think they found a great balance between the church and the garden. There's people who come to the garden who don't go to the church. There's people who go to the church who, of course, don't come to the garden. But where it overlaps, it's amazing. When you get to go and garden with someone on Saturday and see them the next day at church on Sunday, the relationships you can build with people develop pretty quickly.
I've toiled all my lifetime, still I find I'm poor.
I never seen a garden like I seen that in my life.
My door, with its pans of biscuits, bowls of gravy, pans of biscuits.
To see something run like this, that is all done by like basically community service, people helping out, is pretty amazing. And you just think, why not have everything run this way?
We shall have. Good, I can start hearing some harmony now. Now, you gotta do the harmony on the gospel version, okay? Here we go. See if y'all know this. Palms of victory, crowns of glory, palms of victory, we shall wear. We're gonna wear those crowns. Here we go. Palms of victory, crowns of glory, crowns of glory, palms of victory.
God wants all of us together and come together and be happy together and unite with each other with all different kind of race and size or shape or color of people, and just enjoy God's creation because He made us all.
Version. Trails of trouble, roads of battles, paths of victory, we shall walk. We're gonna walk those. Trails of troubles, trails of trouble, roads of battles, roads of battles, paths
Okay.
of
So
victory.
that's the conclusion of the documentary there. So just a few concluding words. We need to only imagine the abundant way of life. Wow, that's bright. We only need to imagine the abundant way of life that our Lord calls us to live, and then begin living as if that were true. So I'll simply just end with a few questions. What if your church decided to start a food project? What if your church planted a community garden? What if different churches, different denominations worked together to create these infrastructures of holiness that tried to seek the peace of the place where God had sent them? Think of the witness that would be to a world that hungers. I'll stop there and take your questions and comments.
How have you seen it affecting the local farmers that bring theirs to the market? Have they been receptive to y'all, or do you think it would be beneficial to invest in their livelihood? I'm just trying to figure out what's a good marriage between the two. I mean, we
That's a
don't
great
want to
question.
take away from them.
It's a great question. Is this on? Question back. Very smart than I am. Figured out. I don't think it needs to be an either or. Is the quick answer. I think it's both and. I think the advantage of a community garden that the church promotes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
The advantage of a church garden is that it's a place where people can come together and learn. Learn from each other, learn how to grow food, learn how to be in community with each other, begin to learn this new way of life that God is calling us to. And I think that will lead them to buying food from their local farmer rather than just getting it all at Walmart for as cheap as they possibly can. You know? So I think the garden is a training ground. And in our case, we saw that the local farmers right around us, rather than feeling threatened, were excited that we were doing that. And were very eager to help, donating time and expertise. We had a local sod farmer with just one of those big monster tractors come down and till up our land when we first started. And after that, we had enough hand labor that we were working the beds by hand, but we had a lot of help from local farmers. Yeah.
I'm in a mountain county, growing season's pretty short up there. Are there ways to get engaged in this that doesn't necessarily end up in a community garden?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are all kinds of models, and that's what I've been learning as I've gone to these different communities, is that no one community garden looks the same, no one church agricultural project looks the same. I think the folks at Crossfire have done some really creative work. You might show up at a refrigerated trucking warehouse and just think, boy, what good is this place for, you know? And look at what they've done with it and are doing with it. So I think really we're only limited by our imaginations. I think if you have the desire to get out in your community and try to create some kind of hub around food, then I think you really just have to do kind of an asset-based like Alan was talking about, do an asset-based, what do you call it, Alan?
Asset-based
Development. Where you see what you already have here and what can we do with it. Yeah. It's that 3 o'clock lull, 4 o'clock lull, everybody's kind of got the 1,000-yard stare going. Yeah, back in the corner.
I just see it as something that, of course, like many of you, your brain starts working. That some of the older generations teach the younger generation how to put up food and how to can it.
Absolutely.
You know, some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we had at our community garden, we had some of the elderly church ladies do canning workshops. Actually, a couple of our members there were certified canners, certified canning instructors, I guess. And they did a number of workshops, and you'd be amazed at how many people really wish they knew how to can, but don't have anybody to teach them. It's a lost skill, lost art. And the church had this amazing restaurant-grade kitchen, and that's where the canning workshops happened, about a mile down the road from the garden. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
I was up in New York for a while and lived in apartments. And being from the South, you know, I like to do a little garden and stuff, so I made my own little boxes. They had potatoes and peppers and different things like that. And there was an office right next to it that the ladies like to come out and smoke. They would come over there and just garden. And they enjoyed just that small area of where I had the tomato plants and peppers and those types of things, you know. I used a little imagination on it, and I built the frames and the boxes, you know, and painted it up and put some hearts and different things on it, you know. So the point is, you really don't have to have a really large ways. You can actually, you know, be creative with it as long as you have the soil and proper nutrients.
Yeah. Did everybody get to hear Duncan talking about the hot box? He talked about it in the first workshop, but just getting $10 or $20 invested in supplies, you can get a little, build a little box, put some potting soil in there, cover it with an old window, and there's an instant greenhouse. You know, you can start your seeds there. So it's really just limited by your creativity. It doesn't cost a whole lot. Maybe one more comment? Yeah.
Have you seen it enrich the church's understanding of the Eucharist? And in what way?
Yeah, I think that one's harder to answer. I think, I can't point to anybody coming up after working on the garden all morning and just saying, I really understand Eucharistic theology now. So that's a harder question to answer, but here's how I would answer that. Every month in the community garden, we would hold a Eucharist service, like out in the garden, during the summer months. Every Saturday morning, we would stop about 11 o'clock, and most of the folks who came to the garden were not members of the church. And it was not sort of compulsory, you don't have to attend, but it was just, this is what we're going to do at this hour once a month, kind of thing. And most people would attend, or they'd sit on the sidelines and watch. And Pastor Grace, the woman you saw in the video, would just set up a simple table, white tablecloth, a simple clay chalice, and a simple clay plate with just some bread on there. And we would have the Lord's Supper right out among the cabbages. And it was, for me, really brought it home more than anything else. And then after that, we would go and have a potluck lunch together. So it was just this kind of seamless, this is the food that's being grown, this is the food that we're going to eat now among us, and this is the Lord's table where we're fed in all manner of ways. And so I think that just gets embodied in people's spirits and bodies and souls. They just kind of start to inhabit the fact that Eucharist happens out in the garden. And it's a good reminder. It's kind of bringing it full circle to when the early church would share an actual meal together. You know, that's why Paul had to say, some of you are eating too much when you get together, and some of you aren't eating enough. But somehow along the way we lost that it was an actual meal. So this is just one way to bring that back. I think I'll stop there, and if anybody has more questions, I'd love to hear them up front. But thank you all for coming.
Thank you all. We do have some break time tonight now, and enjoy it. Maybe get out and take a little walk, and we will try to get back together at 4:45 over at the Murphy Center where the lunch was. All right. Thank you, Fred. For a little while before I introduce Fred Bahnson, though, I want to once again give you a little heads up about what we'll be doing after that. We will finish this time together at about 4:30, and then we'll have a little break again, and then we will go back over to the Murphy Center where we had lunch, and we'll go into the cafeteria, and the tables are going to be set up, and you'll go in through the line, and as you come in, you'll get a piece of paper with a number on it. We want each person to go to the table with their number on it, and there will be a set of questions there at your table for you to what your thoughts are about faith and